talk about Hong Kong for a minute. They have just very recently issued a practice note on transfer pricing, despite the lack of any arm's length pricing rule in the legislation, which
major
is
drawback,
interesting. Yes. Hong Kong has long been almost admired by some places as having a simple, predictable, clear tax system, and it's depending upon how you look at it, really been part of Hong Kong's success story over the last few decades.
Sure it has.
You've been here for 20 years now. How do you see that developing? Personally, I think it's becoming a bit too rigid, and the government isn't flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions, such as the new exchange of information requirements. You're involved with the Law Society Tax Committee.
Yes, I am.
What's your view of the Hong Kong tax system and the government's approach to tax matters today?
I think that the government is not quick enough to change the rules in order to adapt to changing circumstances. I think that's a fair criticism. It takes matters of almost seismic proportions for the revenue to act and to propose changes to the legislation. And that, again, is another problem, is it seems to be all policy driven by the IRD, which is, I think, incorrect. There should be a separate policy for taxation in Hong Kong, much like there is in the US or in Australia. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're faced with is a system that was devised 50 years ago for an economy that was 50 years ago, and it hasn't really been brought up to date. Is there competition with other regions? I don't think that really plays into the mind of a lot of people, but in fact, that's happening. We are competing with Shanghai. We are competing with Singapore. Both of those locations, in my view, are much fleeter of foot when it comes to legislation, business-friendly legislation.
Okay. I mean, Singapore, let's turn to that. Do you find them easy to deal with? Do you find their approach of incentives plus commitments to spend on overheads, etc., a sort of useful way to proceed?
What is nice about Singapore is that you can get certainty, and the rates are relatively low, and just that in itself is very helpful. Understanding some of the incentives, and they've got a whole range of them, I think is still kind of difficult, and they're of limited use, I think, to at least to a U.S. multinational. Okay. But it's there. It's another way to proceed. Hong Kong does it different, just simple low rate, flat tax, easy to understand.
Right, but it seems to me certainty is less of a feature in Hong Kong than it used to be.
It is.
It's got more difficulty now predicting whether someone will get time apportionment on their salary or whether an offshore profits claim will be accepted or not.
Yeah, I attribute that largely to the assessing practice over at the IRD, that there is no longer uniformity of assessments. And we've certainly found, and others that I've spoken to in industry have found that, it depends what assessor gets your problem and how it's resolved. Mm-hmm. So it never used to be a personality-driven system like that. And I'm not entirely sure why it is now, but it has become that. And, it can be very difficult to predict, particularly in areas of time apportionment or offshore claims, where you sit.
Yeah. Okay. Australia, is that, it has a very complicated tax system. It has reams of tax legislation and guidance.
It does. And a very aggressive revenue department as well.
Okay.
Yes.
But you mentioned earlier, sometimes you can have a discussion, a
yes.
reasonable discussion.
Yes, you can.
So where do they, on the scale of sort of horrible to wonderful, where would you put Australia?
Australia can be very difficult as well. When they get an idea in their head that they want to go after you, they will. And it's very difficult to turn that train. So I would put them pretty high. I mean, they're not in the league with India exactly yet, but they are very difficult.
Okay, how about indirect taxes? We've talked mostly about income tax. Presumably, you've got GST filing requirements in a number of countries.
We do. We're tagged with indirect tax in many locations. And that actually is an interesting point, because although, you know, rates are lower, and you would think that that would be kind of a no-brainer. It's supposed to collect itself, for Pete's sake. That's the attraction of VAT. Not always the case. I mean, there is leakage, particularly across borders, as to, you know, what would constitute an export, or what would constitute a zero-rated supply. And that's an item that really catches the attention of management, because it falls below the line and it affects profits, and therefore they're very keen to minimize those taxes. And we find ourselves increasingly being drawn into those areas.
Okay, one last question, and I think our time's about up. You're a lawyer. You have been in a number of working environments. I think you worked for Deloitte as a manager, senior manager for several years.
Yes.
You got an LLM, and you worked in a law firm for several years.
That's right.
You've been in the corporate environment now in-house, where, from my own experience, I know there's a lot of tax accounting to be done.
Yes, there is.
The whole tax reserve, the FIN 48.
Particularly for SEC.
How do you feel as a lawyer without an accounting degree, sitting in the seat you're in as a corporate tax director?
Well, I would answer that by saying that, you know, we all have our strengths, and frequently your background doesn't determine that. I know a number of accountants who can, you know, parse through a sale and purchase agreement and argue about tax indemnities better than lawyers, and that's really, you know, ultimately a legal issue. And I know a number of lawyers who are very good at, you know, reading financial statements and finding out where the problems are. So I think it depends on your background. And if you're asking me on the spectrum, where do I fall? Certainly it would be on the legal side of the spectrum. But you know, you can't let financial statements scare you, and particularly with you know, some training back in Deloitte and other places, it's doable. You know, everybody has their strengths, and I happen to have a particularly strong team in that regard as well, that I rely on a lot.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Jeff.
Okay. And thanks for watching this edition of the International Tax Post.